Welcome guys to Java Space. In this video we are going to talk about our own custom endpoint. So all along from the previous videos or lectures we saw how we can query the already existing endpoints that a Spring Actuator comes with, and then we saw how we can create our own custom metrics, and our own custom metrics then become part of the metrics endpoint. But we have not talked about now creating our own custom endpoint. So this video or this lecture would be dedicated towards that. So Spring Actuator provides an option to create your own endpoints. So if you want to create an endpoint, all you need to do is create a class and annotate it with @endpoint. And that class must be a Spring Bean, which would mean that it will be annotated with one of the stereotyped annotation. At component or its other specializations of a component, like a service, a repository, all those others. Then once you have annotated your so-called bin class, you can now specify some other additional annotations on the methods of that particular class. So those additional annotations we have at read operation, which would handle the get requests when you query the endpoints, because we know that Spring Actuator all is giving us is endpoints, nothing more, nothing else, and that's why we need some external system now to take those endpoints and persist them and visualize them. So now these endpoints, they still, remember we talked about the protocols that it can be HTTP endpoint or it can be through JMX. So if it's HTTP, obviously we can talk of HTTP methods, get, post, delete, put, and all that. So in this case, your particular endpoint can be furnished with a read operation, the method in that particular class, which then becomes an endpoint, and it becomes a get. Then you have a write operation, which becomes a post request. Then you have a delete operation, which would handle some delete requests as a HTTP method type. Then you might want to do some filtering when you are reading those endpoints. Then Spring also provides an annotation called @selector, and this annotation you can pass it to the method, and you can use that as you pass it through the method. You can now postfix it with the parameter type and the parameter name. So in this case, we have a read operation, and then we have a selector, then we have string name, which means that this particular endpoint would take a string as an argument, which will then be used to filter some data. Maybe you want a subset of that particular data, then you can pass this @select. So @endpoint exposes your endpoint over HTTP as well as JMX, but you might want to only expose to either JMX or to HTTP. So if only JMX is a protocol that you desire, the @endpoint that we initially say you put it on top of a class, should then be replaced with @JMX endpoint. And if you only HTTP access is required, then the endpoint you can replace it with @web endpoint. So all these endpoints, the @endpoint, the @web endpoint, @JMX endpoint, they have two attributes, the ID and the enable by default. So the ID will then become an identifier for your endpoint. So for instance, when you talk of a health, you say /actuator/health. That health is an identifier. Or you can say /metrics. That metrics is an identifier. Or you can say /bins. It's an identifier /env/info. So in this case, you will have to provide that ID to differentiate your endpoint from all the others. And that ID must be unique. So, and this identifier is mandatory. That means you cannot create that endpoint without it. And then the enable by default is not mandatory, but its value is set to true, which then means that that endpoint is enabled by default. So that is it about custom endpoints. So in the next lecture, we are going to code this custom endpoint.